In the shadowy world of elite military operations, where silence is survival and identity is a luxury few can afford, there exists a figure so enigmatic that even hardened Navy SEALs speak her name in hushed whispers. They call her Falcon, not because she soars above her enemies, but because when she strikes, her prey never sees her coming. The Pentagon files list her as Asset F7, but the men who've served alongside her know better. She's not just another operator. She's the ghost that walks through walls, the shadow that bleeds information from the most secure compounds, and the reason why some of the world's most dangerous terrorists simply disappear. Her real name is buried so deep in classified archives that even she sometimes forgets it. What matters isn't who she was, it's what she became. And what she became would soon teach an entire SEAL team that everything they thought they knew about warfare was just the beginning. This is her story. The story of how a woman with no official identity became the most feared operative in modern military history, and how her legend would forever change the men brave enough to fight beside her. The Humvee's engine coughed and died in the middle of the Iraqi desert, leaving Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole and his four-man reconnaissance team stranded 40 miles behind enemy lines. The sun hung like a merciless eye in the cloudless sky, and the silence that followed the engine's death felt heavy with invisible threats. "Radio's dead too," reported Corporal Jenkins, tapping frantically at the communication device. "Something's jamming our signals." Cole cursed under his breath as he stepped out of the vehicle, his boots sinking into sand that felt hot enough to cook eggs. They were supposed to be conducting routine surveillance on a suspected weapons cache, but nothing about this mission felt routine anymore. The intel had been too clean, too convenient, and now they were sitting ducks in hostile territory with no backup coming. That's when they first saw her. She emerged from what seemed like empty desert, as if the sand itself had taken human form. The figure approaching them wore desert camouflage that seemed to shift and blend with the landscape in ways that made Cole's eyes water when he tried to focus on her. She moved with a predatory grace that immediately put every man on edge, their weapons halfway to ready position before she raised one hand in a universal gesture of peace. "Easy, boys," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance despite being barely above a whisper. "If I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Cole found himself staring into eyes that seemed to hold secrets darker than the bottom of the ocean. She was smaller than any of his men, probably no more than 5'6", but something about her presence made the desert feel suddenly crowded. Her face was unremarkable in the way that meant she could disappear into any crowd, but her eyes were ancient, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and survived things that would break lesser people. "Who are you?" Cole demanded, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Something about this woman made him feel like a rookie again, despite his 15 years of service. "Call me Falcon," she replied, pulling a water bottle from seemingly nowhere and tossing it to Jenkins, who looked ready to collapse from heat exhaustion. "And right now, I'm the difference between you getting home to see your families and becoming statistics in tomorrow's casualty reports." She approached their disabled Humvee with the confidence of someone who had intimate knowledge of every piece of military equipment ever manufactured. Within minutes, she had the hood open and was examining the engine with hands that moved like a surgeon's, precise, economical, deadly efficient. "Sabotage," she announced, holding up a small electronic device that none of them recognized. "Someone wanted you stranded here. The question is whether they wanted you captured or killed." The words hit the team like physical blows. The idea that their mission had been compromised from the beginning made Cole's stomach turn cold despite the desert heat. But before he could process the implications, Falcon was moving again, this time toward a ridge that rose from the sand about 200 meters away. "Follow me," she called over her shoulder, "and try to step where I step. This area has been seeded with pressure mines." The next hour passed like a fever dream. Falcon led them through a maze of hidden dangers that Cole's trained eyes hadn't even noticed. She pointed out sniper positions carved into distant rocks, showed them tripwires that looked like natural desert debris, and guided them around minefields that had been laid with military precision. "How do you know all this?" whispered Private Morrison, the youngest member of the team. "Because I helped design half these defenses," Falcon replied without looking back. 3 months ago, I was on the other side of this operation. The word should have been a red flag, should have triggered every security protocol Cole had ever learned. But something in her tone, something in the way she moved through this deadly landscape like she owned it, made him trust her despite every instinct screaming warnings. They reached a concealed observation post just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. From their elevated position, Cole could see the entire valley spread out below them, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The suspected weapons cache they'd been sent to investigate wasn't just real, it was massive. Trucks, artillery pieces, and what looked like enough ammunition to supply a small army were positioned throughout the valley. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the ambush waiting for them. 60 men, Falcon said quietly, passing him a pair of high-powered binoculars, positioned along your original approach route. They knew exactly when and where you were coming. Cole studied the enemy positions through the binoculars, his military mind automatically cataloging threats and calculating odds. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just an ambush, it was an execution setup. Someone had fed them to the enemy like meat to lions. There, Falcon pointed to a cluster of rocks about halfway down the valley. Your friend Jenkins would have triggered that IED about 2 clicks from your target. The explosion would have disabled your vehicle and announced your presence to everyone in the valley. Then, the crossfire would have started. She traced the enemy positions with her finger, showing him how the ambush had been designed. It was a masterpiece of tactical planning, designed to ensure that nobody walked away alive. Cole felt sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat trickling down his spine. "Who sold us out?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Someone high enough up the food chain to have access to your mission parameters," Falcon replied. "Someone who knew your route, your timeline, your communication frequencies. Someone you trust." The implications hit him like a sledgehammer. A leak in their own command structure meant that every mission, every operation could be compromised. His men weren't just in danger here and now. They were in danger every time they stepped into the field. "So what do we do?" Cole asked, feeling helpless for the first time in his military career. Falcon turned to look at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment, he saw something that might have been pity. "We give them what they want," she said quietly. "Your death. But not the way they planned it." Over the next 2 hours, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Falcon outlined a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. Maybe both. She had studied the enemy positions, identified their weaknesses, and developed a strategy that would turn their own trap against them. "The beauty of an ambush," she explained, sketching diagrams in the sand with her finger, "is that it requires precise timing and coordination. Disrupt either one, and the whole thing falls apart." She showed them how they could use the terrain to their advantage, how to turn the enemy's superior numbers into a liability, how to create chaos in what should have been their moment of perfect control. It was like watching a chess master explain a game to amateurs, except the pieces were deadly and the stakes were their lives. "You want us to walk into their trap?" Jenkins asked incredulously. "I want you to make them think you're walking into their trap," Falcon corrected. "There's a difference. A crucial one." As night fell across the desert, transforming the landscape into something alien and mysterious, Falcon began preparing for what she called the performance of your lives. She had equipment that Cole had never seen before, devices that could project sounds across vast distances, create false heat signatures, and scramble electronic surveillance. "Where did you get all this?" Cole asked, watching her assemble what looked like small radio, but emitted pulses of energy that made his teeth ache. "Let's just say I have friends in places that don't officially exist," she replied with a smile that held no warmth. "Friends who understand that sometimes the best way to serve your country is to operate outside its official channels." The first phase of her plan began just after midnight. Using her mysterious equipment, she created the sound of their Humvee starting up and moving through the valley. To the enemy forces waiting in ambush, it would sound like Cole's team was finally approaching their target, following their original route into the trap that had been so carefully prepared. From their concealed position, Cole watched through night vision goggles as the enemy forces stirred into action. Men moved into final positions, weapons were checked and readied, communications crackled with tense anticipation. The trap was being sprung, except there was no prey in it. Phase 2. Falcon whispered into her throat microphone. Suddenly, the valley erupted in confusion. False radio chatter filled the airwaves, making it sound like Cole's team was calling for backup, reporting enemy contact, requesting immediate extraction. The enemy forces, trained to intercept and interpret such communications, began repositioning themselves to respond to threats that didn't exist. "Beautiful," murmured Morrison, watching the chaos unfold below them. "They're fighting shadows." But Falcon wasn't done. Phase 3 of her plan was the most audacious yet. Using a combination of explosives and electronic warfare, she began systematically destroying the enemy's own equipment. Ammunition dumps exploded in spectacular fireballs that lit up the entire valley. Communication towers toppled. Vehicles burst into flames. To the enemy forces, it looked like they were under attack by a much larger and better-equipped force. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Units began falling back, abandoning their positions, calling for reinforcements that would never come. "How are you doing this?" Cole demanded, watching in amazement as years of enemy preparation crumbled into chaos in a matter of hours. "I'm not doing anything," Falcon replied with that cold smile. "They're doing it to themselves. I'm just encouraging them." By dawn, the valley that had been prepared as Cole's team's graveyard had become a wasteland of abandoned equipment and scattered enemy forces. The weapons cache that had taken months to assemble was now a collection of smoking craters. The ambush that should have been their death had become their enemy's worst nightmare. "Time to go," Falcon announced as the sun began to rise. "Your cavalry will be here soon." Indeed, Cole could already hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching. Somehow, impossibly, their communications had been restored, their position had been triangulated, and a rescue mission was en route. "How did you arrange all this?" he asked as they prepared to move to the extraction point. "I didn't arrange anything," Falcon replied. "I just made sure that the right people receive the right information at the right time." Amazing what a difference good timing can make. As they made their way across the desert toward the sound of approaching rescue, Cole found himself studying this mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere and saved their lives. She moved through the landscape like she owned it, stepping over dangers that would have killed any of his men, navigating by stars, and instincts that seemed to come from another world entirely. "Who are you really?" he asked as the helicopters became visible on the horizon. Falcon paused in her movement and turned to look at him one last time. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and he saw something vulnerable underneath all that deadly competence. Something human. "I'm someone who used to believe in clean missions and clear objectives," she said quietly. "Someone who learned that the real war is fought in shadows, where the rules don't apply and the only victory is survival." The helicopters were setting down now, kicking up clouds of sand and dust that began to obscure everything. In the chaos of the landing, Cole lost sight of Falcon for just a moment. When the dust settled enough for him to see clearly again, she was gone, vanished into the desert, as if she had never been there at all. The only proof that she had existed was the fact that he and his men were still alive. Later, when the debriefing officers questioned him about how they had survived, Cole found himself struggling to explain what had happened. The official report would list their escape as a result of enemy equipment malfunction and tactical errors. The truth would remain classified at levels he didn't even know existed. But sometimes in the quiet moments between missions, Cole found himself scanning the horizon and wondering if she was still out there. The ghost in the desert. The woman who had no name, no official existence, no place in any organizational chart. The woman they called Falcon, who had shown him that everything he thought he knew about warfare was just the beginning. 6 months after the desert incident, Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole found himself in the sterile corridors of the Pentagon, walking toward a meeting he had never requested and couldn't officially attend. The summons had come through channels so classified that even his commanding officer claimed no knowledge of it. Just a simple message. Conference room Delta 70800 hours. Come alone. The room was smaller than he expected, windowless, and lined with sound-dampening material that made his footsteps seem muffled and distant. 3 people waited inside. A Navy admiral whose nameplate read Morrison, but whose face Cole had seen in intelligence briefings about black operations. A woman in civilian clothes who carried herself like someone accustomed to having people killed, and, sitting at the far end of the table, Falcon. She looked different in the artificial light of the Pentagon. Less like a desert ghost, and more like what she really was, a weapon wrapped in human skin, refined by years of training that went far beyond anything the military officially acknowledged. Her eyes met his across the room, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition or warning. "Sergeant Cole," the admiral began without preamble, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that could get you executed for treason if you ever repeat it. Do you understand?" Cole nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. He had expected debriefings about the desert mission, maybe some questions about operational security. He hadn't expected this. "Good. Then, let me introduce you to the reason you're still alive. This is Agent Falcon of a program that doesn't officially exist, operating under authorities that are never acknowledged, pursuing objectives that have no oversight except from this room." The woman in civilian clothes leaned forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that suggested she was used to moving nations like chess pieces. "Sergeant, the leak that nearly got your team killed wasn't an isolated incident. For the past 18 months, our operations throughout the Middle East have been compromised with surgical precision. Someone with access to our highest-level planning has been feeding information to enemy networks." Cole's mind raced through the implications. 18 months of compromised operations meant dozens of missions, hundreds of lives at risk, strategic objectives that had failed for reasons that were only now becoming clear. "How many people have died?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Too many." Falcon spoke for the first time since he'd entered the room. Her voice was flat, emotionless, but Cole caught the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested this was personal for her. "And it's going to get worse unless we stop it." The admiral activated a wall display that showed a complex network diagram. Names, faces, organizational charts that mapped relationships across military and intelligence hierarchies. As Cole studied it, he began to recognize some of the names. People he had served under, officers he respected, officials whose authority he had never questioned. "The beauty of the network we're dealing with," the civilian woman continued, "is its sophistication. They're not selling secrets for money or ideology. They're playing a longer game, manipulating our operations to achieve strategic objectives that serve interests we don't fully understand yet." "Foreign government?" Cole asked. "We don't think so," Falcon replied. "The pattern suggests something more complex. Someone who understands our systems intimately enough to corrupt them from within, but who's working toward goals that don't match any known foreign intelligence objectives." She stood and moved to the display, pointing to specific nodes in the network diagram. Every compromised operation has had one thing in common. They were all targeted at disrupting what we call irregular assets. People like me, operatives who work outside official channels, who can't be controlled through normal command structures. The implications of what she was saying hit Cole like a physical blow. Someone wasn't just selling secrets. They were systematically hunting down and eliminating the military's most effective covert operators. "Someone's trying to clean house," he said quietly. "Exactly. And they're using our own systems to do it." The admiral's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good people die for political reasons. "Agent Falcon has been investigating this network for 8 months. What she's discovered suggests that the corruption goes higher than we initially suspected. Falcon returned to her seat, and when she spoke again, her voice held the kind of certainty that came from having lived in shadows long enough to recognize the shapes they made. 3 weeks ago, I identified the primary node in the network. The person who has access to the right information, the right timing, the right operational details to make all of this possible. She paused, and Cole found himself holding his breath. General Patricia Hawkins, Deputy Director of Operations, Defense Intelligence Agency. The name hit the room like a bomb blast. Cole had heard of General Hawkins. Everyone in the intelligence community had. She was a legend, a woman who had risen through the ranks during some of the military's most challenging years, someone whose reputation for integrity was supposed to be unimpeachable. That's impossible, Cole said automatically, though even as he spoke, he realized how naive he sounded. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you, Falcon replied. General Hawkins was my commanding officer during my first assignment with irregular operations. She recruited me personally, trained me, sent me on missions that shaped my entire career. I trusted her with my life. The past tense wasn't lost on any of them. What changed? The civilian woman asked. I started paying attention to things that didn't add up. Falcon activated another display, this one showing a timeline of operations spanning 2 years. Every mission that went wrong, every ambush that succeeded, every operation that failed for reasons we couldn't explain, they all traced back to intelligence that had passed through General Hawkins' office. She walked them through the pattern with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months building an unshakable case. Operations in Afghanistan where target buildings had been mysteriously evacuated hours before raids. Missions in Iraq where enemy forces had been waiting in exactly the right positions to maximize casualties. Intelligence gathering efforts that had been anticipated and countered before they could even begin. But here's the thing that really convinced me, Falcon continued, bringing up a new set of files. The pattern wasn't random. The operations being compromised weren't chosen for their strategic value or their intelligence potential. They were chosen because they involved irregular assets, operatives who worked outside normal command structures. Cole studied the file she was showing them, and slowly the picture began to come together. Every compromised mission had involved people like Falcon, ghosts who operated in spaces between official acknowledgement, people whose elimination would never show up on any official casualty reports. Someone's been systematically hunting down and eliminating off-the-books operators, he said. Not someone, Falcon corrected. General Hawkins. And she's been using our own intelligence systems to do it. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, looking older than his years. The question is why? Patricia Hawkins has served this country for 37 years. Her record is exemplary. What could possibly motivate her to betray everything she's sworn to protect? It was a question that Falcon had obviously been wrestling with for months. When she answered, her voice carried the weight of personal betrayal. I think she's trying to save the country from people like me. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Cole found himself staring at this woman who had saved his life, trying to understand how anyone could see her as a threat worth eliminating. Think about it from her perspective, Falcon continued. For 37 years, she's watched the military evolve, become more complex, more dependent on operations that exist outside official oversight. She's seen people like me operate with minimal supervision, carrying out missions that could start wars or topple governments, answerable to almost no one. She moved back to the timeline display, but now she was highlighting different operations, successful ones, missions that had eliminated high-value targets or disrupted enemy networks. Every success we achieve makes the case that irregular operations are necessary. Every mission we complete outside official channels proves that sometimes the system has to be circumvented to get results. And every time that happens, we become more autonomous, more independent, more dangerous. Cole was beginning to understand. She sees you as a threat to civilian control of the military. Worse than that, she sees us as a threat to democratic oversight itself. Falcon's voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration for her former commander's conviction. even as she worked to destroy her. From her perspective, we're unaccountable weapons that have grown too powerful and too independent. We're exactly the kind of threat that the Founding Fathers designed our government to prevent. The civilian woman who had remained silent through most of the briefing finally spoke again. The problem is that she's not entirely wrong. Her words created a moment of uncomfortable silence in the room. Cole looked around the table and realized that everyone present was part of the very system that General Hawkins was trying to dismantle. People who operated with authorities that were never officially acknowledged, pursuing objectives that had no oversight except from rooms like this one. So what do we do about it? Cole asked. We stop her, Falcon replied simply. But we do it in a way that doesn't prove her point about the dangers of unaccountable power. Over the next hour, Falcon outlined an operation that was breathtaking in its complexity and audacious in its scope. She had spent months mapping General Hawkins' network, identifying the people she was working with, understanding the methods she was using to identify and eliminate irregular assets. The key is her communication system, Falcon explained, showing them intercepts of coded messages that had taken her weeks to decode. She's not working alone. There are at least 6 other senior officers involved, plus civilian contractors and intelligence analysts who believe they're serving the greater good by helping to eliminate what they see as rogue elements. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. People at the highest levels of military and intelligence hierarchies all working together to systematically eliminate operatives whose existence was only barely acknowledged in the first place. How do we prove it? The Admiral asked. Everything you're showing us is circumstantial. We need evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. We get her to reveal herself, Falcon replied with a smile that held no warmth. We give her exactly the kind of target she can't resist, an irregular asset operating completely outside official oversight, pursuing an objective that could destabilize entire regions if it goes wrong. Cole felt a chill as he realized what she was suggesting. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to create a situation where she has to expose her network to stop what she perceives as an imminent threat to national security. Falcon's voice held the kind of certainty that came from someone who had already accepted the risks and moved on to planning how to minimize them. And if she succeeds in eliminating you, the civilian woman asked, then she proves that irregular assets can be contained through existing oversight mechanisms, and the threat she's been trying to eliminate disappears anyway. It was, Cole realized, a perfect trap. Either General Hawkins revealed her network by trying to stop Falcon's fictional operation, or she accomplished her original objective by actually stopping it. From Falcon's perspective, both outcomes serve the greater good. What do you need from us? The Admiral asked. Authorization to conduct a deep penetration operation against a target that doesn't officially exist, Falcon replied. Something so sensitive that it would require the kind of irregular asset that General Hawkins is trying to eliminate. She pulled up another display showing satellite imagery of a compound in a country that Cole couldn't identify from the markings. The facility looked like a mixture of research laboratory and military installation, surrounded by security measures that suggested whatever was happening inside was important enough to kill for. This is a biochemical research facility operated by a terrorist network that our traditional intelligence services can't penetrate. The kind of target that would normally require months of planning and congressional approval to approach through official channels. The Admiral studied the imagery with the eye of someone who had planned similar operations. How do we know this target actually exists? Because I've been building it for the past 3 months, Falcon replied matter-of-factly. False satellite imagery, manufactured intelligence reports, fake communications intercepts, everything needed to make it look like an imminent threat that requires immediate action. The audacity of what she was proposing took Cole's breath away. She had essentially created an entire fictional crisis, complete with supporting documentation that could fool intelligence analysts at the highest levels. When General Hawkins receives intelligence about this facility, she'll face an impossible choice, Falcon continued. Either she allows what appears to be a critical national security threat to go unaddressed, or she reveals her network, by trying to prevent me from reaching the target. And if she chooses to let the fictional threat proceed, the civilian woman asked, then we know she's willing to compromise national security to serve her larger objectives. Either way, we get the proof we need. The plan was approved with a speed that suggested it had been anticipated long before Cole had been brought into the room. Within hours, false intelligence reports about the fictional biochemical facility were being fed into systems that General Hawkins monitored. Communication intercepts suggesting an imminent terrorist attack were planted in databases she had access to. Most importantly, authorization for an irregular asset to investigate and potentially neutralize the threat was processed through channels that would trigger all of her security alerts. Cole found himself assigned as Falcon's liaison for the operation, officially to provide military oversight, unofficially to serve as a witness to whatever revelations emerged. As they prepared to deploy to a staging area in Eastern Europe, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more complex than any of them understood. You realize this could go wrong in about 100 different ways, he told Falcon as they reviewed their mission parameters one final time. It could, she agreed. But the alternative is letting her continue to eliminate people who serve the same country she claims to protect. Sometimes the only way to preserve a system is to expose the people who are corrupting it from within. They deployed that evening on a flight that didn't officially exist, heading toward a mission that would never appear in any operational reports. As the transport aircraft carried them through the darkness toward whatever waited ahead, Cole found himself wondering if they were heroes or villains in a story that had no clear moral boundaries. What he did know was that somewhere behind them, General Patricia Hawkins was receiving reports about their mission and making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died in service to objectives that neither of them fully understood. The hunt had begun in earnest. The only question was who would emerge as predator and who would become prey. The abandoned Soviet research facility in the mountains of Eastern Europe looked exactly like the fictional target Falcon had described to the Pentagon 3 weeks earlier. Which made sense, Cole realized, since she had apparently been using this real location as the template for her manufactured intelligence all along. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were now conducting a genuine mission to a site that had been chosen specifically because it would make a convincing fake mission. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked as they surveyed the compound through high-power binoculars from their concealment in the tree line above. "About 8 months," Falcon replied without looking away from her own surveillance equipment. "Ever since I started suspecting that someone was hunting irregular assets. I needed a location that would be convincing enough to draw out whoever was behind the leaks, but isolated enough that we could control what happened when they showed up." The facility below them was a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and steel towers that looked like something from a Cold War nightmare. Most of it had been abandoned for decades, but Cole's trained eye could pick out signs of recent activity. Cleared approach routes, maintained power lines, vehicle tracks that were too fresh to be coincidental. "Someone's been here recently," he observed. "General Hawkins' advance team arrived yesterday," Falcon confirmed. 12 operators, military contractors, mostly people who think they're here to prevent a catastrophic terrorist attack. She passed him a tablet displaying intercepts from encrypted communications. As Cole read through them, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The messages detailed a plan to eliminate what the senders believed was a rogue operative pursuing an unauthorized mission that could destabilize international relations. "They think you've gone rogue," he said. "That's exactly what General Hawkins wants them to think. In her mind, she's not betraying her country. She's saving it from people like me who operate outside proper oversight." Falcon's voice carried a note of something that might have been respect for her former commander's conviction, even as she worked to destroy her. The communications intercepts painted a picture of a woman who genuinely believed she was serving the greater good. General Hawkins had convinced her network that irregular assets had become too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to democratic institutions. Every operation they conducted outside official channels was evidence that the system itself was breaking down. "She's not entirely wrong," Cole admitted reluctantly. People like you do operate with almost no oversight. The question is whether the alternative is worse, Falcon replied. Whether the threats we face can be addressed through normal channels, with normal oversight, following normal rules. She gestured toward the facility below them. In the 3 weeks since their Pentagon briefing, intelligence services throughout the region had been frantically trying to verify the supposed biochemical weapons research happening in this location. Every investigation had come up empty, but the fictional threat had seemed credible enough to trigger emergency response protocols at the highest levels. If there really was a terrorist network developing biological weapons here, how long would it take to get official authorization for a mission like this? Falcon asked. Cole knew the answer without having to think about it. Congressional briefings, international consultations, diplomatic negotiations. The process could take months, during which time any actual threat would have ample opportunity to relocate or accelerate their timeline. Too long, he said simply. Exactly. And General Hawkins knows that as well as anyone. She spent her entire career watching threats emerge faster than our official systems can respond to them. She's seen good people die because proper procedures took too long to follow. Falcon began assembling equipment that Cole had never seen before, devices that looked like a hybrid between military electronics and advanced scientific instruments. When she was finished, she had created what appeared to be a portable laboratory capable of detecting and analyzing chemical compounds at the molecular level. What's all this for, he asked. Because while this facility is abandoned, it's not empty, she replied, her voice taking on a grim tone that suggested they were about to discover something unpleasant. 3 months ago, when I was researching locations for this operation, I found records suggesting that this place was used for biological weapons research right up until the Soviet collapse. What I didn't expect was to find evidence that someone had been continuing that research. The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. You mean there really is a biological weapons program here? Was. Past tense. But whoever was running it left in a hurry, and they didn't clean up properly. Falcon shouldered her equipment pack and began moving down the hillside toward the facility, which means we need to secure whatever they left behind before General Hawkins' team gets here and potentially destroys evidence of an actual threat. The next hour passed in a blur of careful movement through abandoned corridors and empty laboratories. The facility was larger than it had appeared from outside, a maze of underground passages and hidden chambers that suggested its original builders had been preparing for something far more extensive than basic research. What they found in the deepest levels of the complex made Cole's blood run cold. Laboratory equipment that had been abandoned so recently that some of the electronic displays were still powered. Research notes in multiple languages detailing experiments that violated every international treaty on biological weapons. Most disturbing of all, evidence that whoever had been working here had been close to completing their research. How close? Cole asked, studying containment vessels that looked like they had been emptied in a hurry. Close enough that we need to assume they succeeded, Falcon replied grimly. She was using her detection equipment to scan the laboratory surfaces, and the readings she was getting made her frown deepen with each measurement. The good news is that whatever they were developing, they took it with them when they left. The bad news is that they left behind enough contamination to suggest they were working with something that could kill thousands if it were deployed properly. Cole found himself staring at research notes that described biological agents designed to be undetectable until they had already spread through target populations. The level of sophistication was terrifying. These weren't crude terrorist weapons, but precisely engineered tools of mass destruction developed by people who understood exactly what they were creating. Who was funding this, he asked. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Falcon was photographing everything, documenting evidence that would need to be analyzed by specialists far more qualified than either of them. What I do know is that this discovery changes everything about our situation. She was right. What had begun as an elaborate trap to expose a conspiracy within the military had suddenly become something far more urgent. There was a real threat somewhere out there, developed by people who had been operating in this facility until very recently, and they had no idea where those people had gone or what they intended to do with their research. General Hawkins needs to know about this, Cole said. General Hawkins is going to know about it, Falcon replied with a smile that held no warmth. But probably not the way she expected. Her meaning became clear over the next few minutes as she began setting up what looked like a sophisticated communications array in the center of the laboratory. When she was finished, she had created a direct link to military command structures that bypassed all normal security protocols. Emergency transmission to Pentagon Command. She spoke into the device. Priority Alpha clearance required. Cole listened in amazement as she detailed their discoveries to what sounded like a room full of senior military officers. She described the abandoned research, the evidence of biological weapons development, the indication that whoever had been working here had completed their research and taken it with them. Recommend immediate deployment of specialist teams for site analysis and contamination assessment, she concluded. Also recommend emergency alert to international partners regarding potential biological weapons, threat of unknown scope, and targeting. The response was immediate and intense. Cole could hear multiple voices on the other end of the connection, people asking rapid-fire questions about the nature of the threat, the timeline of the research, the potential for immediate deployment against civilian targets. Site will remain under observation by irregular assets until specialist teams arrive, Falcon concluded. Estimated arrival time for backup is 6 hours. She cut the connection and turned to Cole with an expression he couldn't read. Now General Hawkins has to decide whether her crusade against irregular assets is more important than responding to an actual biological weapons threat, she said quietly. The answer came faster than either of them expected. Cole's radio crackled to life with an encrypted communication that identified itself as coming from a Pentagon emergency response team. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and absolutely convincing. Agent Falcon, this is General Hawkins, Pentagon Emergency Response Command. We're tracking your discovery and preparing immediate response. Your orders are to secure the site and await specialized containment team arrival. Estimated time to your location is 90 minutes. Falcon stared at the radio for a long moment before responding. Acknowledged, General. Standing by for specialist arrival. After she cut the connection, Cole looked at her with growing unease. That was too fast, he said. Even emergency response doesn't work that quickly. It wasn't emergency response, Falcon replied quietly. It was General Hawkins using the crisis I created to draw me into a trap. She's coming here personally to eliminate what she sees as a rogue asset that's spiraled beyond any possibility of containment. The next 90 minutes passed with agonizing tension as they waited for whatever was coming. Falcon used the time to establish defensive positions throughout the facility, creating multiple escape routes and fallback positions that would allow them to control the engagement when it came. You could leave, she told Cole as they finished their preparations. This isn't your fight, and you don't need to be caught in the middle of it. I'm exactly where I need to be, Cole replied firmly. Someone has to witness what happens here. Someone has to make sure the truth gets told, regardless of who wins. The first indication that General Hawkins had arrived came from motion sensors that Falcon had placed around the facility's perimeter. 12 figures moving with military precision, approaching the complex through routes that suggested they had detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and defenses. She's good, Falcon admitted as she tracked their approach on her surveillance equipment. Professional, thorough, exactly the kind of officer you'd want commanding your forces in a real crisis. Except she's here to kill you, Cole pointed out. Except she's here to eliminate someone she genuinely believes represents a threat to everything she's sworn to protect, Falcon corrected. From her perspective, this is the most patriotic thing she's ever done. They could hear the assault team moving through the upper levels of the facility now, clearing rooms with methodical efficiency. These weren't random mercenaries or corrupt contractors. These were skilled professionals who believed they were conducting a legitimate national security operation. Agent Falcon, General Hawkins' voice echoed through the facility's public address system, which she had somehow managed to reactivate. I know you can hear me. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in what's about to happen here. Falcon keyed her own communications device, broadcasting on a frequency that would reach not only General Hawkins, but also the emergency response teams that were genuinely en route to investigate their biological weapons discovery. General Hawkins, I understand your concerns about irregular assets operating outside proper oversight, but there's something you need to know about this facility. Over the next 10 minutes, as the assault team continued their systematic approach through the complex, Falcon transmitted everything they had discovered about the biological weapons research. She provided detailed descriptions of the laboratory equipment, read portions of research notes that described weapons capable of killing millions, shared analysis data that proved someone had been developing actual threats to international security. This isn't a manufactured crisis, General, she concluded. This is a real threat that was discovered by the kind of irregular asset you're trying to eliminate. Someone was developing biological weapons in this facility, and they completed their research before abandoning it. Right now, we don't know where they went or what they plan to do with what they developed. The response, when it came, carried a note of genuine uncertainty. Even if what you're saying is true, General Hawkins replied, it doesn't change the fundamental problem. You operate with no oversight, no accountability, no constraints except your own judgment. Today you might be stopping a real threat, but what about tomorrow? What happens when someone like you decides that the real threat is our own government? It was a question that cut to the heart of everything they had been struggling with. Cole found himself thinking about all the irregular assets he had known, all the operations that had been conducted outside official channels, all the decisions that had been made by people who answered to almost no one. You're right, Falcon replied after a long pause. People like me are dangerous. We operate outside the systems that are supposed to prevent abuse of power. We make decisions that could affect millions of lives based on our own judgment of what serves the greater good. The assault team had reached their level now. Cole could hear them moving through corridors that were only minutes away from their position. But the question isn't whether people like me are dangerous, Falcon continued. The question is whether the threats we face can be addressed by people who operate within those systems. Whether democratic oversight is compatible with the speed and secrecy required to stop weapons like the ones that were being developed here. General Hawkins' response was immediate and firm. That's not our choice to make. The moment we start deciding that democratic processes are too slow or too cumbersome to serve national security, we stop being servants of democracy and start being its masters. Even if it means people die who could have been saved? Falcon asked. Even then. Because once we cross that line, once we decide that we know better than the system we're supposed to serve, there's no way back. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the assault team breaching the final barriers between them and Falcon's position. Cole found himself holding his breath as armed figures appeared in the laboratory doorway, weapons trained on the woman who had saved his life and might now be about to die for the principle she represented. But instead of opening fire, the lead operative lowered his weapon and spoke into his radio. General, you need to see this. Over the next hour, as military specialists examined the evidence that Falcon and Cole had gathered, the entire dynamic of their situation shifted. The biological weapons research was real, the threat was genuine, and the implications were terrifying enough to override every other consideration. General Hawkins herself arrived at the facility 90 minutes later, along with teams of specialists who confirmed that someone had indeed been developing weapons capable of mass destruction in the abandoned Soviet laboratory. The contamination levels alone were enough to trigger international emergency protocols. When she finally confronted Falcon face-to-face in the laboratory where it had all begun, Cole expected anger, recrimination, perhaps even an attempt to continue the mission that had brought them all there. Instead, General Hawkins simply looked tired. "You've proven your point," she said quietly. The threat was real, the intelligence was actionable, and traditional channels would have been too slow to respond effectively. But that doesn't resolve the fundamental issue," Falcon replied with equal quiet. "It just demonstrates that both of our positions have validity." They stood facing each other across the contaminated laboratory. Two women who had dedicated their lives to serving their country, who had reached opposite conclusions about how that service should be conducted. "What happens now?" General Hawkins asked. "Now we find out who is running this facility and what they plan to do with their research," Falcon replied. "And we do it together, using both traditional intelligence channels and irregular assets, with the kind of oversight that preserves democratic accountability while still allowing for the speed and flexibility that genuine threats require." It was, Cole realized, a compromise that neither of them could have reached without going through everything that had brought them to this point. The conspiracy that had nearly gotten his team killed in the desert, the elaborate trap that had exposed General Hawkins' network, the discovery of a real threat that validated both of their perspectives. All of it had been necessary to arrive at a solution that neither could have achieved alone. 6 months later, the biological weapons research from the abandoned facility had been traced to a terrorist network that was planning attacks against civilian targets in 3 countries. The investigation that found them combined traditional intelligence gathering with irregular asset deployment, conducted under oversight protocols that satisfied both democratic accountability and operational necessity. General Hawkins was quietly reassigned to a position where she could develop new frameworks for supervising irregular operations. Falcon continued her work in the shadows, but now with formal reporting requirements that ensured her activities were subject to appropriate review. And Cole found himself serving as a liaison between conventional forces and irregular assets, helping to build the kind of integrated approach that could address complex threats without sacrificing either effectiveness or accountability. The woman known only as Falcon had proven that legends could coexist with democracy, that effectiveness and accountability weren't mutually exclusive, that sometimes the greatest service to a system was to push it to evolve rather than to destroy it or preserve it unchanged. Her real name remained classified. Her operations continued to exist in shadows, but she was no longer a ghost operating entirely outside official recognition. She had become something new, a weapon that served democracy rather than threatening it, a legend that strengthened the system rather than undermining it. The SEALs who worked with her now understood that her legend wasn't built on operating outside the system, but on proving that the system could evolve to meet the challenges that threatened it. She remained dangerous, remained deadly, remained capable of operations that most people couldn't imagine. But she was no longer alone in the dark, making decisions that affected millions with no oversight except her own judgment. She had found a way to serve that preserved both the effectiveness that made her legendary and the accountability that democracy required. In the end, that might have been the greatest mission she ever accomplished. Not the elimination of a particular threat, but the proof that heroism and democracy could coexist, that legends could serve something greater than themselves without losing what made them legendary in the first place. The woman they called Falcon had shown everyone, SEALs, generals, civilians, and enemies alike, that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal wasn't someone who operated outside the system, but someone who could help the system evolve to meet the challenges that threatened it. Her legend would continue, but it would be a different kind of legend, one that proved strength and accountability could coexist, that effectiveness and oversight weren't enemies, that sometimes the greatest victory was finding a way for everyone to serve the same cause without compromising the principles that made that cause worth serving. That was the lesson she taught, the truth she embodied, the legend that would outlast any individual mission or operation. In a world where threats evolved faster than institutions could adapt, she had shown that evolution itself could be a weapon, not against democracy, but in its service.